In August of 2023, in a county where limestone is so close to the surface you can hear it crack under a hard frost, a woman named Margaret Voss walked onto 11 acres of what her industry would have called a hobby operation, and stood for a long time without saying a word. Margaret was a senior buyer for a botanical supply network that serviced 14 garden conservancies across 3 states. She had been in the business long enough to stop being impressed by things that looked expensive and start being impressed by things that were true. She picked up a 14-inch planter, sedum and creeping thyme and sempervivum, arranged through what looked like mountain scree, and held it at eye level in the afternoon light for a long time. Then she set it down. She asked one question. The man who owned the land answered with a number. Margaret opened her notebook and wrote a different number. That different number, $126 more than the man had been charging, was the kind of number that doesn't land as a surprise so much as a confirmation. A verdict handed down slowly by facts that had been accumulating for years. 12 years before that, in the spring of 2011, a certified industrial engineer named Brad Culver stood at the same fence line in clean steel-toed boots and called what Dale Heimer was building a nuisance hobby. Brad was operations manager for Meridian Aggregate and Cement, which had been operating a plant 4/10 of a mile north of Dale's property since 2001, and he was polite and reasonable and entirely certain that the piles of limestone fines and crushed aggregate his trucks had been delivering to Dale's fence line since 2007 were a liability arrangement he was doing Dale a favor to continue. Dale listened to what Brad had to say. Then he went back to work. Let me tell you about the 12 years between those two moments. Let me tell you about a retired mail carrier, 11 acres of Indiana limestone country, a red heeler named Huck, a leather journal that smelled of tobacco and lanolin, and what happens when a patient man pays close attention to a pile of something the industrial world decided had no value. Dale Heimer was 67 years old in 2023, which meant he had been watching things grow in Garfield County his entire life. He had his father's face and his father's habit of crouching down close to the ground when something interested him, turning it over in his hand rather than naming it from a distance. He had retired from rural mail delivery at 58 and come back to the 11 acres his father Elmer had left him in 1998, along with an old farmhouse, a timber-frame barn that still stood plumb, and a leather-bound observation journal that Elmer had started in 1961 and kept until his hands stopped cooperating. Elmer Heimer had not been a scientist. He had been a man who paid attention. For nearly 4 decades he had walked the fence rows of his property and written down what he noticed in plain declarative sentences, with dates and measurements and small hand-drawn maps. On page 3 of that journal, in neat blue ink, he had written a sentence that Dale read on the 3rd night after the funeral, and did not fully understand for another 8 years. The sentence read, "Some soil needs what the ground already forgot it had." What Elmer had noticed, beginning sometime in the early 1960s, was that a section of the east fence row where an old limestone quarry cart had overturned and spilled its load grew certain plants with unusual vigor. Yarrow and wild columbine and a particular creeping stone crop that had no business surviving Indiana winters at that elevation came up thick along 40 feet of fence, where the soil was gray and gravelly, and looked, to a conventional eye, like the worst ground on the property. Elmer had measured the drainage. He had compared the wildflowers to the same species 30 yards away in the dark topsoil and found the fence row plants, bloomed 2 weeks earlier, held their color deeper into August, and survived the dry years that flattened everything else. He had written all of this down, without a theory, because he was an observer and not a theorist. Dale inherited the journal in 1998, and the Meridian plant opened in 2001, and in 2007, a Meridian driver named Ron knocked on Dale's door and asked if the company could deposit aggregate fines and limestone screening material along the fence line rather than hauling it to the regional landfill 43 miles away. It was a beneficial use arrangement, Ron explained, which was a legal category that meant Meridian could save the landfill tipping fees if a property owner agreed to accept the material for agricultural or landscaping purposes. Dale said yes because he was a practical man, and because the fence line was already rough ground, and because somewhere in the back of his mind, Elmer's journal page was waiting to make sense of something. Huck was 2 years old that first summer, a heavy-boned red heeler with a dark stripe across his muzzle that would go gray over the years of this story. He walked the fence line with Dale every morning and every evening, and when the first Meridian truck backed up to deposit its load in the spring of 2007, Huck sat at Dale's knee and watched the crushed limestone fines pour out in a pale gray heap, and neither of them seemed particularly worried about it. What came off those trucks did not look like anything a garden center would sell. It was pale, almost white in dry weather, ranging in particle size from pea gravel down to a powder fine enough to leave a chalky residue on the hand. The Meridian drivers called it screenings, which was the industry term for the material that fell through the smallest sorting mesh during aggregate grading. To the plant, it had no commercial value. It was a disposal problem. Dale let it pile up along the fence line and watched it through the first summer and the first winter, watching how rainwater moved through it and how it dried after a storm and how the ground underneath it settled under the weight. In the second summer, he noticed that the pale gray heap had begun to grow a thin crust of vegetation on its upper edges, where windblown seed had found purchase, and the plants that came up were yarrow and stonecrop, the same species Elmer had noted along the old quarry spill in the 1960s. He walked back to the house and got the journal, and stood at the fence with it open to page 3 and read that sentence again. Some soil needs what the ground already forgot it had. He stood there for a while with the journal in one hand and a handful of pale aggregate in the other, and Huck sat at his boot and waited, the way dogs wait when they understand that something's being worked out. In the spring of 2009, Dale built his first containers. He did not have a formula yet. He had an observation and a hypothesis, and 40 years of watching what plants do when you give them what they need instead of what the catalog says to give them. He mixed the screenings into a batch of planting medium, 2 parts screenings to 3 parts leaf mold he had composted from the oak and hickory stand at the back of the property, and filled 12 cedar plank boxes he had built himself from boards salvaged off the old corn crib. He planted them with creeping phlox and hens and chicks, and a hardy sedum he had ordered from a specialty grower in Vermont, whose catalog described it as requiring sharp drainage and an alkaline substrate. The sedum was $30 a tray. Most of his neighbors would have said that was too much to spend on something you were guessing at. Dale thought it was the right price for information. Brad Culver came out in May of 2011. He drove a company F250 with the Meridian logo on the door, and he wore boots that were steel-toed and spotless, and he brought a clipboard and the confident bearing of a man who had passed his professional engineering exam on the first attempt. He was 48 years old. He genuinely liked Dale, and he had a liability concern. The aggregate piles had grown. By 2011, they ran along 200 feet of fence, at 6 to 8 feet high in places, and one of Meridian's attorneys had flagged the site during a routine compliance review. Brad wanted to discuss the arrangement. He was not a bad man. He believed in documented systems and quantifiable outcomes. He had a master's degree in civil engineering from Purdue, and he operated inside a worldview that sorted materials into categories: waste and beneficial use and inert fill. And he was sincere in his belief that what Dale was doing with the aggregate was at best a distraction, and at worst an undocumented liability for both parties. He looked at the fence line, and then he looked at what Dale had started building, and he chose a word that was friendly in tone and precise in meaning. "That's a nuisance hobby, Dale," he said. "And I say that with respect. These piles need to be documented and recertified under the current beneficial use guidelines, and honestly, your containers there aren't what we had in mind when we set up the arrangement." He gestured at the rows behind the barn with the clipboard. He was trying to be helpful. In his experience, people who worked outside formal systems usually did so because nobody had explained the formal systems to them, and the explanation was the remedy. He had brought paperwork for a revised beneficial use agreement. He talked through it for several minutes while Dale stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and Huck sat between them and watched a sparrow cross the fence line. Dale had 40 containers laid out in rows behind the barn by then. He had started them in 2009, 2 years into watching the aggregate sit along the fence, after he went back to page 3 of Elmer's journal and started mixing the limestone fines and crushed aggregate screenings into his planting medium in proportions he had worked out by trial and error over 2 growing seasons. The containers were a mix of cedar planks he had cut himself and galvanized steel tubs he had picked up at farm sales, filled with a medium he had arrived at through observation rather than instruction. Roughly 40% of Meridian's aggregate fines and crushed limestone screenings, 40% locally sourced decomposed leaf mold, and 20% coarse builder's sand. He was growing alpine plants, drought-tolerant natives, heirloom vegetables, and specimens that had no business surviving in the flat, heavy clay soils of Garfield County. By that second spring, 2/3 of them were thriving in a way he had not seen in conventional container stock, holding their color through a dry stretch in August that had turned the neighbors' annual beds to straw. Brad looked at the containers. His expression was that of a man who had been asked to assess something outside his field and was being careful to limit his assessment to his field. He did not crouch down and look at the medium. He did not ask what Dale was growing or why. Dale said, "They seem to be doing all right." Brad said he would send the revised paperwork. Then he drove away, and the sound of the Meridian F-25 on the gravel faded north toward the plant, and Huck stood at the end of the driveway and watched it go. Let me tell you what the aggregate was actually doing, because this is the part that took Dale 2 growing seasons to work out, and that took Brad Culver 11 years to believe. Cement plant aggregate fines, specifically the limestone screenings and the fine crushed material produced as a byproduct of aggregate grading, carry several properties that conventional, bagged growing media do not. The first is particle size distribution. The screenings from a limestone plant grade from about 1/4 inch down to dust, which means when you blend them into a planting mix, you create a structure where large particles hold air pockets, medium particles bridge between them, and the finest material fills gaps without compacting under pressure the way peat or fine topsoil does. The result is a medium that drains freely in heavy rain, holds just enough moisture in its fine particles to sustain root zones through dry stretches, and never forms the hydrophobic crust that kills container stock in heat events. Water moves through it the way water moves through mountain scree, which is what it resembles and what it essentially is. The second property is pH. Limestone fines are alkaline, and they buffer the planting medium against the acidification that happens naturally as organic matter breaks down in a container. Most nursery stock in commercial growing media needs periodic lime applications to maintain pH balance. Dale's medium maintained its own balance because the limestone was already in it, releasing calcium carbonate slowly across years. The plants Elmer had noticed along that old quarry spill in the 1960s had been doing exactly this. They were thriving, not in spite of the limestone, but because of it. The mountain plants Dale started growing in his containers in 2009, sedum and sempervivum and alpine phlox and creeping thyme, drought-tolerant natives adapted to rocky alkaline hillsides, were in their native substrate because he had reconstructed it from what Meridian's trucks kept delivering to his fence. The third property was less visible and took Dale longer to understand. Limestone aggregate provides a stable mineral surface that certain beneficial soil organisms colonize preferentially. In a peat-based commercial medium, the organic matrix breaks down over 2 to 3 years, collapsing the air pockets that root systems depend on and turning the medium dense and anaerobic. In Dale's aggregate blended medium, the mineral structure was permanent. It did not degrade. The organic fraction of the mix decomposed as intended and fed the plants. But the drainage architecture stayed open because it was built on stone, not fiber. A 4-year-old container of his, turned out of its box in 2013 to examine the root mass, showed a white network of fine roots through every layer of the medium, from the surface down to the drainage holes. In a conventional container of the same age, the lower third would have been compacted and wet. Dale had not named what he was seeing. He had written it down in a spiral notebook he kept on the potting bench, in the same plain declarative sentences his father had used in the leather journal, and he kept working. He had no formal training in horticulture. He had a journal, a fence line, 40 years of watching things grow, and a healer who walked the rows with him every morning. His qualification was attention. He had paid it without apology for 6 years before anyone with a credential took note, and by then the answer was already in the containers. By 2013, he had 300 containers on the property, and Gary Sutter, who farmed the parcel adjacent to Dale's on the south side and ran a conventional nursery operation from a set of 3 aging greenhouses, had begun noticing. Gary was a good man and a practical farmer, and he had watched Dale stack aggregate along the fence since 2007, with the patient skepticism of someone who has watched a neighbor do a thing he cannot quite make sense of. He had stopped by once, in the summer of 2012, and walked Dale's rows and picked up a handful of the medium and rubbed it between his palms and looked at it. He had not said anything dismissive, which was itself a kind of consideration. He had set it down and said he did not know what to make of it, and that Dale's plants looked good, and then he had driven back to his greenhouses and his drip lines and his bag commercial substrate and his farm credit loan and not looked back for a while. Gary's operation ran on commercial, bagged growing media, drip irrigation, and a loan from the farm credit office in town that he serviced faithfully and worried about in dry years. He had heard Brad Culver at the 2013 County Agricultural Extension meeting, and he had found Brad's assessment plausible because Brad had a degree in a presentation and Dale had a red healer and some homemade planters. That meeting, in January of 2013, was the second time Brad Culver put a name to what Dale was doing, and he did it in front of 40 neighbors. Meridian had been invited to present on aggregate disposal and beneficial use regulations, and Brad had a slide deck and a clear, confident delivery, and he was genuinely trying to be informative. When someone in the back row asked about Dale's arrangement specifically, Brad had nodded and said carefully that what was happening at the Heimer property represented a folk application with no agronomic foundation, and that Meridian was working to bring the site into proper compliance. He said it without malice. He said it with the patient certainty of a man who had never been wrong about something that could be measured. Someone near the front of the room had laughed quietly, the way people laugh when they feel the comfort of a thing they already believed being confirmed by authority. Dale was not in the room. He had not been invited and would not have come if he had been. He was home that evening, in the barn, building cedar boxes for a new run of containers he intended to plant in March. The wood fragrant and fresh cut in the winter air, Huck asleep against the wall with his legs twitching through a dream. If you think about what was happening in those years from a distance, the picture is clear enough. A man with a degree and a company vehicle said, in front of witnesses, that a thing had no agronomic foundation. A man with a journal and a dog went home and kept building. The county registered the first opinion as authoritative. The second went unrecorded. That is how most useful things work. And most of the time, no one writes it down. If you have ever watched a patient thing and a fast thing run side by side for a few years, you know that the fast thing looks like it is winning for a long time. That is what the middle years of this story looked like from the road. Gary Sutter broke ground on a fourth greenhouse in 2016 and a fifth in 2018. The financing was $340,000 across both expansions, and he serviced it from revenue that depended on irrigation costs staying manageable and wholesale prices staying stable, and the growing seasons staying long enough to turn 2 full flushes of stock. He was a good operator. His greenhouses were well run, and the plastic was tight, and the new heating system kept his nights above 50 degrees even in January. He bought new irrigation controllers and upgraded to a computerized drip system and planted what the wholesale buyers were asking for, which in those years meant ornamental grasses and native perennials and a large volume of dwarf conifers for landscape contracts. He carried a debt load that required him to move 2 full flushes of stock every season and to hit his per-unit cost targets within 2%. He was doing it. His numbers were good. In those years, Gary looked from the road like a man who had his operation figured out, and Dale looked from the road like a man who had been given a pile of industrial waste and made some garden decorations out of it. Dale had 900 containers in production by 2018 and was selling them at $35 to $55 apiece to a landscape gardener in Indianapolis and 2 garden centers in the county, and a small number of direct customers who had heard from the landscape gardener and driven out to the property. His annual revenue was modest enough that it did not require any structure beyond a spiral notebook and a checking account at the community bank in town. He was not, by any measure, anyone used publicly, succeeding. If you drove by his property and Gary's property on the same afternoon in June of 2018, Gary's would have looked like an operation, and Dale's would have looked like a hobby. The greenhouses caught the light. The new signs were straight. A truck with a company logo sat at the loading dock. On Dale's side of the county road, a '96 pickup sat under a walnut tree, and a red Healer lay in the driveway, and a long, low barn opened onto row after row of containers in various sizes. The pale aggregate visible along the top of each one, plants you might not know the names of growing through it in arrangements that did not look like anything the garden centers had been selling that year. Nora Heimer had finished her degree in horticulture at Purdue in 2019 and come home for a summer to help Dale after his hip surgery, before taking a position at a corporate nursery group in Columbus. She was 31. She had 4 years of formal training, And she had the particular embarrassment of a young person who loves their grandparent and cannot understand what he is doing. She walked the rows of planters with a professional eye and saw the medium and identified it correctly as off-spec industrial material, and asked carefully whether Dale had considered the liability implications. Brad Culver had used that word too, she noted. Dale handed her Elmer's journal. She read it in 2 evenings. The handwriting was clear and small, and the observations were meticulous, with sketches of root structures and drainage patterns and species lists dated by year and annotated with survival notes. On page 3, she read the sentence and stopped reading for a while. She did not say anything about liability for the rest of that summer. She went to Columbus in September of 2019 and took the corporate position and called home every Sunday. In 2020, the first summer she was gone, a dry stretch in July caused Gary's irrigation costs to spike 40% over the previous year, and Dale lost 6 containers to a root rot that had nothing to do with the aggregate and everything to do with a cedar tub that had not drained properly because he had not drilled enough holes. On a Sunday call in October of 2020, Nora asked Dale what his loss rate had been. He told her. She asked what Gary's had been. Dale told her what Gary had told him. There was a long quiet on the line. There are moments when a person begins to doubt their doubt, and the doubting itself feels like the thing that needs explaining. Nora did not say anything out loud on that October call. She asked about Huck. Dale said Huck was getting gray around the muzzle, but still walked the fence line every morning. Nora said she would be home for Thanksgiving. She watched what happened in 2022 from Columbus at first, and then she came home and watched it in person and did not go back. The summer of 2022 was the worst drought Garfield County had recorded in 40 years. 11 straight days in July with temperatures above 100 degrees and the county's average annual precipitation for the year falling to 62% of normal. The dark topsoils of the county compacted and shed water. Gary's commercial growing media, peat-based and fine-textured and engineered for moisture retention in temperate conditions, turned hydrophobic under the sustained heat. His irrigation ran 18 hours a day, and still the upper root zones of his stock dried, while standing water pooled below the drainage holes. He lost 60% of his nursery stock between July and September, annuals and perennials, and a full flush of ornamental shrubs he had been growing for a landscape contract. The loss came to $180,000 in stock at cost. The county's average nursery survival rate through that summer was 38% of stock across all operations. Dale lost 4% of his containers. 29 out of 712 units in production that summer. The limestone aggregate medium drained freely through the worst heat events, moving water past root zones before it cooked them. The pH buffering held through the stress of the hot spell. The alpine and drought-tolerant specimens he had been growing for years, the ones built for mountain scree and rocky alkaline slopes, performed as though the drought were their native season. Nora drove home in August. She had been calling on Sundays, but hearing it described and seeing it were different things. She walked the rows with Huck at her heels in the late afternoon heat, looking at what had survived and looking at what her grandfather had done with his losses. He had marked each failed container with a small wooden stake and a date, the same way Elmer had marked his field observations in the journal. 29 stakes in 712 containers. She stood in the rows for a long time without speaking. She had driven past Gary's operation on the way in and had seen, without stopping, the empty greenhouse bays and the brown patches in the remaining beds and the irrigation lines running at mid-afternoon with no one tending them. She did not need to stop to understand what the numbers meant. She took her grandfather's journal out to the fence line and sat with it in the late afternoon on the pale gray ridge of the last aggregate pile and read the parts she had not finished in 2019. She read the pages where Elmer had measured root penetration depth in the limestone amended soil against the dark topsoil controls. She read the winter entries where he noted that certain plants he had expected to winter kill along the quarry spill had come through undamaged, and his hypothesis, written carefully in the margin, that the alkaline substrate was buffering the freeze-thaw cycle at the root zone. She read the sentence on page 3 again. She sat there until the sun went low enough that the aggregate ridge threw a shadow across her, and the temperature dropped 5 degrees, and Huck came and lay down against her leg. She called the corporate nursery group in Columbus the following week. She gave her notice effective October 31st. Brad Culver came in September of 2022. The same month, the Indiana Department of Environmental Quality sent Meridian a notice that the beneficial use exemption for their aggregate fines required site documentation and ongoing reporting. The cost of proper disposal, hauling to a certified facility, would run Meridian approximately $47 per ton, which worked out to roughly $120,000 a year that the fence line arrangement had been allowing them to avoid. The math of the situation had changed entirely. Brad drove the company F250 out to the fence line with a crew to deliver what he told Dale would be the last load. He was polite. He had come to like Dale over 11 years of annual site visits and had never felt anything toward him but a mild professional sympathy for a man who did not know how to operate within the structures that would have helped him. He watched his crew unload, and then he stood at the fence for a moment. "I always thought this was more sentiment than science, Dale," he said. "No hard feelings about the arrangement ending." Dale said, "No hard feelings." Huck sat between Dale's boots and watched the truck pull out. Gray muzzle level. Patient. Margaret Voss arrived in August of 2023. She had been referred by a landscape architect in Indianapolis who had purchased 3 of Dale's planters for a residential installation and sent a photograph to the Hartwell Botanical Network's procurement office with a note that said simply that the growing medium was unlike anything she had seen in 20 years of specifying container stock. The landscape architect's note had included a photograph of the root ball she had examined when repotting one of the planters, and Margaret had looked at that photograph for a long time before booking her flight. She drove to Garfield County in a rental car and walked Dale's property for 45 minutes with Nora, asking technical questions about the medium composition and the propagation methods in a voice that suggested she was already calculating. She asked about particle size distribution. She asked about pH management over the life of the container. She asked about sourcing continuity for the aggregate, which was the question Nora had been expecting because it was the question any serious buyer would need to answer before committing to a supply relationship. Nora told her about the second plant in the adjacent county and the agreement Dale had already made for ongoing material. Dale followed them at a distance, not because he was shy, but because he understood that what Margaret was conducting was an assessment that required space to complete honestly, and that the best thing he could do was stay out of her line of sight while she formed her conclusions. She stopped at the row of 14-inch specimen planters for a long time. These were Dale's finest work, sedum and creeping thyme and sempervivum, arranged through aggregate blended scree in compositions that looked like alpine slopes at scale, each plant chosen and positioned over 3 seasons of watching how root systems colonized the medium. She crouched down and looked at the medium surface the way Gary Sutter had not crouched down and looked at it in 2012. She picked up a small handful, felt it, set it down. Then she stood and picked up the planter itself and held it at eye level the way a person does when they are looking at something with the full attention of their professional knowledge. She held it for a long time. The afternoon light came across the fence line at a low angle and lit the sedum a warm green and caught the pale gray of the aggregate between the plants. She set it down. She did not look at Dale or Nora for a moment. She looked at the fence line where the last of Meridian's aggregate piles still stood in pale gray ridges along 200 feet of the property. "What do you sell these for?" she asked. $55, Dale said. Margaret opened a notebook with a wire spiral along the top edge. She wrote something and tore the page out and set it on the top of the planter. 47 of those, she said, at $218 each. $218. The number sat in the warm August air, the way a verdict sits after a long deliberation. Dale did not say anything. Nora did not say anything. Huck lay down at Dale's feet with his chin on the ground and his pale gray eyes moving between the two women and the man and the piece of paper on the planter, and the mountain plants growing in what the industrial world had decided 16 years ago had no further value, $218 per unit. The local garden center had told Dale in 2015 that they could not take his planters above $40 because their customers would not pay more for something that looked homemade. The landscape supply house in the county seat had passed entirely. The 47 planters Margaret Voss purchased that afternoon totaled $10,246 for a single order, and she asked Nora for a production schedule before she left. She said at the car that she would want to discuss a standing arrangement for the following year. She drove back toward Indianapolis and the Hartwell Network and its 14 conservancies. The dust from the county road settled slowly in the August heat. Huck watched the car until it was gone. Brad Culver heard about the sale through Gary Sutter, who heard about it from the woman who ran the county agricultural extension office, who had seen the Hartwell invoice at the regional horticulture show in December. Brad called Dale on a Thursday morning in January of 2024 and asked if he could come out and walk the property. He came the following Saturday in a personal truck, not the Meridian vehicle, wearing his own boots, which had collected a little mud from the drive. He walked the rows with Dale for an hour and asked questions. Not rhetorical questions, real ones. He asked about the particle size distribution in the mix, and about the pH buffering mechanism, and about how Dale had arrived at his proportions. He took a few notes. Near the end of the walk, standing at the old fence line where the aggregate piles had stood for 16 years, he said quietly, "I owe you an apology for 2013. Dale looked at the fence line. "You didn't know," he said. "Neither did I for a long time." They stood there for a while, both of them looking at the ground where the aggregate had stood for 16 years, and where now there was only pale gray residue worked into the soil by rain and frost and time. Brad asked if Dale would be willing to walk him through the mixing process. Dale said he would. Gary Sutter came to the property in February with 2 of his employees, and Dale spent a Saturday morning showing them the composition method and the sourcing approach and explaining what Elmer had noticed along the quarry spill 60 years before. Gary's operation had survived 2022 diminished and in debt, and he was rebuilding slowly, and Dale did not charge him for the morning. He walked them through the mixing ratios and the drainage geometry, and the reason the medium held through dry stretches without compacting. And one of Gary's employees, a young man named Pat, who had worked the greenhouse bench for 3 years, crouched down at one of the containers and looked at the root system the way no one had crouched down and looked in all the years before the number had landed. He asked good questions. Dale answered them in the same plain sentences Elmer had used in the journal. He gave Gary 20 pounds of seed he had saved from his best-performing specimens and a photocopy of the relevant pages from Elmer's journal. And Gary took it home and set it on his workbench and stared at it for a long time. Nora had not gone back to Columbus. She had called the corporate nursery group in October of 2022 and given her notice and stayed to help Dale through the winter. And by spring of 2023, she was running the propagation side of the operation and had begun sourcing additional aggregate material from a second plant in the next county over. She had the journal. She had her grandfather's eye for what a plant needs, which she had thought, in her Purdue years, was sentiment, and which she now understood was a form of knowledge that no curriculum had taught her because no curriculum had been patient enough to learn it. Dale turned the operation over to her in stages over the following year, not because he was done watching, but because watching was what he did best, and watching required someone else to do the selling and the invoicing and the production scheduling. He kept the 11 acres. He refused 2 offers from a landscape company that wanted to license the medium formula. He sold seed and method knowledge to 3 neighboring nursery operators who came to ask, including Gary, and kept his own production at a scale the land could sustain. The fence line was quiet without the Meridian trucks. The planters stood in their rows in the morning light, and the limestone aggregate in each one held its calcium, and its drainage geometry, and its patient alkaline correction, doing the same thing it had been doing since Elmer had noticed the first wildflowers along the quarry spill in 1961. There is a sentence that gets used about knowledge when people try to explain why some kinds of knowing endure and others don't. The sentence usually involves words like wisdom or tradition or heritage. And those words are not wrong, but they point at the idea from the wrong direction. What Elmer Heimer had written in 1961 was not heritage. It was observation. He had looked closely enough at a specific thing in a specific place to notice a pattern that a model would not have generated because no model was looking at that fence row. What Dale had done with that observation was not sentiment. It was patience and arithmetic. He had taken 16 years of aggregate that the industrial world had classified as waste and paid close enough attention to its properties that he built something the industrial world then paid $218 per unit to acquire. The 2 kinds of knowledge that collide in this kind of story are not old and new. They are not rural and credentialed or humble and proud or intuitive and scientific. The distinction is narrower than that, and more important, one kind of knowledge works from a general model outward, applying category and projection and confident extrapolation. The other kind works from a particular place inward, accumulating observation and staying patient with complexity that the model cannot yet name. Both kinds are sincere. Both kinds are trying. The structural difference is what happens at the long time horizon, when the model encounters the exception it had no category for. Brad Culver had not been wrong about the model. He had been wrong about the fence. What is rigid at the edges is the first thing to break when the model meets the exception. What is attentive to the particular place, to the specific drainage angle, to the pH of that limestone, to the memory written in a tobacco-scented journal on a winter night in 1961, is still standing after the shock has passed, with mountain plants growing in mountain scree on a flat Indiana property, and a red heeler going gray at the muzzle, lying in the morning light at the old fence line where it all began.